Good afternoon. I'm Chris Scher, Member Communications Director of the Society of Broadcast Engineers and the co-host of this month's episode of the SBE WEBxtra, the SBE chapter of the web. This is a monthly SBE meeting. The SBE is the Association for Broadcast and Multimedia Technology Professionals with nearly 5,000 members, mostly in the U.S., but also around the world. The host of today's SBE WEBxtra is SBE Treasurer and Social Networking Committee Chair Kevin Trueblood. Hello, Kevin.
Chris, thank you so much for having me. Well, I guess now I'm installed as the new host of the WEBxtra here. And I want to take a moment to say thank you to Kirk Harnack, who has spent a lot of time hosting these WEBxtras as well as organizing them. And no doubt we're going to see Kirk a whole lot in the future as well. But putting some new faces to this presentation as well as some new topics and looking forward to moving forward. And we got a lot to talk about today. Indeed. We were talking to Harold Price from Sage Alerting, as well as our SBE General Counsel, Stephen Hartzell, and we've got Patrick Cross, both from Brooks Pierce, the legal firm that deals with FCC matters. We have a lot to cover as we get into this discussion today, and we're going to do that here in just a couple of minutes. But Chris, you got some business to take care of in the form of the member update.
That is correct, and this is your SBE member update for November 14th, 2022. The next webinars by SBE on the calendar will be presented live on December 20th. It's called Cybersecurity 2023, very timely, and it's led by Wayne Pacino. The timely topic of cybersecurity continues to be an ongoing concern. We'll even cover some cybersecurity issues on today's SBE WEBxtra. So it's all one big happy family. This will be a free webinar, so you just need to register to watch. You can always access the entire library of webinars by SBE presentations on demand. Just find the lists on the website and register there. Last week, two of our guests presented a webinar as well. FCC Compliance Preparing Your Station for a Violation-Free New Year. SBE Regulatory Co-Counsel Steve Hartzell and Patrick Cross cover the compliance issues you should look for and check out for the coming year. For information on these and all the webinars by SBE, go to sbe.org/webinars. And yes, my co-host has returned. The next SBE certification exam window at local chapters is in February 2023. The application deadline for that exam is January 6th. If you don't want to wait, or if a local chapter exam is not convenient for you or not possible because of in-person restrictions, private proctoring is available. For more information on SBE certification, it's online at sbe.org/certification. There are two surveys posted from the SBE, and we appreciate your input. One survey seeks information about disability access for SBE members. The other takes the opening steps as the SBE begins its next strategic planning efforts. Both are available now. The quickest link to each is on the SBE homepage in the pop-up box at sbe.org. There are also links to the October and December issues. There are links to them both in the October and December issues of The Signal. And that is your SBE member update for November 14, 2022.
Thank you so much, Chris, and appreciate seeing the SBE unofficial mascot there in the image. So the cat's always welcome back anytime.
Whether we want him or not, he tends to make an appearance every now and then.
Well, I would say no pets allowed, but my dog is in doggy daycare right now, so he's currently quite occupied instead of trying to be inside the shot. So I understand how that goes. Anyway, thanks for joining us today. And I'm excited to get into this topic about EAS and a lot of these new rules that are being proposed by the FCC. In fact, there's a couple of different ones that really go in depth involving, duplication of alerts and renaming alerts and things like that, as well as certifying cybersecurity and making sure that your plant is compliant to make sure that they don't get hacked. So there's a lot that we have to talk about today. We have a couple of great guests that are very knowledgeable on this topic. One being Harold Price. He's from Sage Alerting. He's the manufacturer of the popular blue NDEC EAS boxes that are in stations all over the country, as well as Stephen Hartzell and Patrick Cross, the SBE General Counsel from Brooks Pierce. They are the legal firm that deal with FCC matters, and all of them have a lot of opinions and certainly expert advice as far as what you can do to keep your station compliant going forward. So We'll go ahead and just dive right into the topic. And one quick side note I do want to mention for those who are on watching us on YouTube and you want to chime in, if you want to ask a question, you can fill out in the chat field there in the live video, and we will try and maybe answer some of those questions as we go through the webinar. So, Harold, I'm going to start with you first as we get into this topic to kind of get a general overview of how our current EAS system is structured, because there's two different ways that you can get alerts, one being the daisy chain system, one being through the internet, and both are still going to be involved going forward. So how is this currently structured? What's required of stations to be compliant these days?
Uh, yeah, hi, I'm Harold Price. Sage Alerting Systems been doing this since 1994. Sadly, just gets longer and longer. Uh, there are two types of EAS. The EAS that's relayed over the air, BRAP, BRAP, BRAP. That's part of the FEMA's continuity of government program to make sure the president can have access to the American people before, during, and after a national emergency. So that part of it is done without respect to the internet. It's a fallback to a fallback to a fallback. And it's a kind of last ditch effort to get connectivity to build up an ad hoc network by relaying from one station to the next. Uh, and some alerts are still issued natively in that language, if you will, in the primary EAS. All weather service alerts come through the emergency alert system via the old daisy chain. Uh, the new way of doing it, required since 2012, is IPAWS, Integrated Public Alert and Warning System, from FEMA. They use a protocol called CAP, Common Alerting Protocol. Inside all of those acronyms is the old style EAS message, just wrapped in modern computer XML. It's digitally signed, it's secure as it moves through its transmission scheme. Some alerts are issued through IPAWS, usually local emergencies or state. Required monthly tests are often issued through IPAWS now. Amber alerts through IPAWS. They're originated through IPAWS. No matter how they get to the individual station, either the legacy EAS or through CAP, EAS participants, and that's all broadcasters and other folks, are required to put that on the air by a certain rule set. Some of the alerts are required, some of them are voluntary. Uh, Required to put them on the air. Now, there are then not only two ways of getting alerts, but two ways that you deal with alerts. Usually, most stations simply relay alerts. They come in through one of the two methods, they get relayed, they go out. Some stations will originate alerts on their own. The local primary is sort of the top of the daisy chain, the LP1, LP2. They will often originate monthly tests. And they will sometimes originate alerts, usually on their own. That's not typical, or at the behest of a local or state emergency authority. Uh, State authorities usually have their own way of issuing alerts, but sometimes that way of issuing it is through an LP1. That's typically in smaller areas or more dispersed areas where there's not a lot of population. The FCC's concern in all of this is that you put the alerts on the air that you're supposed to, and you don't put anything on the air that you're not supposed to, no matter where it may come from. That's why they're interested in cybersecurity. Every aspect of a modern broadcast plant has some finger in the pie of cybersecurity. Everything you do now has a computer involved somewhere. Cybersecurity needs to be done for all of it. The back office operations, your automation system, your STL, how you control the transmitter, how you make sure the front door to the transmitter building is locked. All of that stuff, cybersecurity is involved. We hear about it with EAS a lot because of the direct public safety aspect of it. These alerts are going on the air. If a bad one gets in the air, it causes confusion and loss of faith in the system. If a good one doesn't get on the air, well, that's people who didn't get warned when they could have. So that's why we keep hearing about cybersecurity. That's part of the reason why the FCC is doing the push that they're doing now. And that's a
So
background
you
on
touched
where
on
we're
a
at.
lot. Yeah, you touched on a lot of great things there, and a couple of questions that I have when it comes to that is, you touched on why cybersecurity matters with EAS, but without getting into too much detail, we all kind of know what the security flaws are with or at least we have some idea of what some of those flaws may be or how they could be exploited. But what are the problems that we've actually seen with false alerts or something that's gotten transmitted that shouldn't have been? What have we seen over the years?
Over the years, there have been a couple of issues where, and I think in a lot of cases, they were either passwords that were known for some reason, or were the default passwords on the device. People don't execute good password security. Uh, Most of the devices that are out there have known passwords that are the default when you get them, and when you install your equipment, you're supposed to change the passwords. These days, especially for the Sage equipment, you get nagged every time you log in with the default password until you change to use the proper password. So there were some cases where people were able to access devices and either inhibit alerts or send their own alerts. Uh, those are the main ones that we're talking about here with cyber security. There have been other incidents of improper use of EAS. Some of them is through advertising, where people use elements of EAS as attention-getting devices to make you listen to the ad. The FCC is very vigilant on uh, passing out fines when that sort of thing occurs. There are also some self-inflicted wounds where someone at a station, and this has happened more than once, there was a large incident where many hundred stations were involved. There was a smaller one where just one station was where the operator will essentially take an alert that was issued for some other purpose and replay it on the air, either as a joke, as part of news, or as just a flat out mistake. Uh, that happens as well. That is an issue with EAS alerting. It's not necessarily a cybersecurity issue. In these cases, they were authorized people at their authorized position, just doing something that they shouldn't have. There is a third category, and it is difficult when the FCC is writing the rules of alerts that were issued by proper authorities in error. The false warning missile attack in Hawaii was one of them. Was somebody who was at an authorized position with all the proper tools to do the job. They wanted to put an alert on the air. It did go on the air. It turned out to have been a very bad idea to put that alert on the air. That had nothing to do with cybersecurity, but it was a case where a bad alert, an improper alert, went on the air. And what is the individual station's responsibility for notifying the FCC that their equipment has put a bad alert on the air? It has never been defined precisely, but I think the FCC wants to know about all of these things. They want to know how often it happened, why it happened. Part of it's to make sure that it doesn't happen again at that particular location, and part of it is to get the word out of here's a new class of things you can do that aren't good, and let's all learn from them. So part of this new set of cybersecurity rules is tell us about these things that happen, so we can make new rules to help them not to happen again.
And right now, to be clear, we're talking specifically on what applies to broadcast stations, which is the EAS system, and then there's the WEA, which is the what is it, the wireless equivalent or emergency alerts that goes over
Yeah,
cell
wireless
phones. This
emergency
doesn't
alerts.
play into anything that we do for broadcasters, correct?
That is correct. They're initiated through the iPause system using the originator sends a message to iPause. Typically, those messages can have an EAS element as well as a WEA element. Uh, the FEMA system takes care of sending the EAS stuff out to the EAS stations. It takes the stuff meant to go to WEA, does some additional massaging on it. It thins out the alert, getting rid of extraneous information, sends only what cable systems, I'm sorry, what cell phone systems need to do it, send it through an additional gateway, but it still originated in the same way. It flows through a system similar to ours, and the cellular vendors then do their thing. There are a whole lot of opportunities there for cybersecurity as well, both at the cell phone plant itself, which they're fairly good on all of that. But some of it has to do with the handsets. And can you spoof someone into thinking, here's a real alert when it wasn't? And the FCC is also interested in those things, but they don't really affect broadcasters per se.
Yeah, I think what I've seen, they've gotten really good at alerting, and I know there's people that can talk a whole lot more with more authority on this subject than I could, but probably some of the best examples I've seen over the years are like around here, we had a tornado outbreak on a January afternoon, if you can believe that, a tornado outbreak in southern Florida. But with the push of a button, the FC or the National Weather Service was able to send out an alert that went to broadcast, that went to highway signs, that went to phones, all in under a minute. And that's all just the centralized alerting protocol that you're talking about that's able to hit all of these things. But broadcasters are just one component of that overall system.
That is correct, but it is both. We as the broadcast community and the cell phone folks, they fall under that FCC umbrella. So they have taken the opportunity to address both issues in a single notice of proposal.
Gotcha. Well,
Let me,
let's get in.
if I could, there was one thing I would like to mention, where there's another bit of overlap, and it's a compliance issue, which is why I'd like to bring it up. Harold was talking, excuse me, Harold was talking about how it is not a good idea to use EAS tones for any purpose other than authorized purposes, which would be a test, an actual alert, or an approved PSA, public service announcement, over the broadcast platform. Similarly, WEA tones are not permitted to be used for any purpose other than an authorized purpose. And what we have seen, I'm not aware yet of any fines that have come out of it, but the FCC says that we can also not use WEA tones over the broadcast platform. And what we have seen is an effort by stations in newscasts to help educate the public, pardon me, about WEA tones and what it means when our mobile devices all start buzzing when there is an emergency information going out. And I want everybody to remember that you can't put WEA tones on the air, even for educational purposes in a newscast. Even if you're coming from a good place to do so, that still violates the FCC's rules.
That's a fascinating angle. And just to take a moment to introduce you guys, that's Stephen Hartzell that was speaking. There's also Patrick Cross that's in there, both from Brooks Pierce, who are the general counsels here to provide some insight on the legal ramifications of all of this. And although I do want to ask a quick question, because this actually came up recently as we went through Hurricane Ian with WEA tones, because obviously that's going to hit your phone. It makes the big blast and makes the similar attention tone that that accompanies EAS. But what about if there's a news anchor who's got their phone in their pocket and it goes out over the air live?
In that case, my position would be that that's okay because it's actually a live alert. That alert, the tones are not being used to distribute an old alert. They are not being used to, promote commercial products and services. They're not even being used to educate. That's just straight up an example of an actual real-time alert where those tones are going out over the broadcast platform, not unlike an actual EAS alert that would go out.
The collateral damage, as it was, of sending those out is there. Everybody's going to hear it. It's kind of like if you're at a public event and everybody's tones go off, everybody in the room is going to have their phone just light up at the same time. Okay, so let's dive into a couple of the different proposals, because as I understand, there is one revision to the EAS code that's already been approved and will be forthcoming, and then there's a second one that's being proposed. So let's start first with what is going to be changing, which deals with the cap priority, as well as the I believe renaming some of the event codes. Can you guys talk a little bit about what those changes are coming?
Sure. So the what you're referencing there is sort of an adjunct to the proposal that we're talking about today thus far with the cybersecurity plan. The FCC has been very involved in EAS issues lately, in particular because you've got a 2-2 commission split right now, and so it's a very easy issue to push through EAS and sort of the resiliency of our alerting systems. So they have also, in addition to the notice of proposed rulemaking we're discussing today, recently adopted a report and order that changes some rules. The biggest that you just mentioned is the cap priority mandate. And so there was an excellent explanation earlier about how IPAWS and CAP formatting is sort of takes the hierarchical daisy chain that we're used to and uses those same alerts but packaged in a more flexible format. There's more that you can do with it. And so the FCC has now adopted rules that it will be still a little bit over a year before the actual compliance deadline hits for broadcasters, but effectively it's going to require broadcasters in December of 2023 to start prioritizing cap formatted alerts whenever possible. And so if a broadcaster receives an EAS message through the hierarchical daisy chain and from IPAWS at the same time, then they'll need to push out the IPAWS, the cap formatted alert. Similarly, if they receive a legacy EAS alert through the daisy chain, then they'll need to pull the IPAWS system within a defined time period and wait to see if there's an IPAWS alert available. I believe it's 10 seconds for that period there. And then if they are able to obtain a cap formatted version of the alert from IPAWS, then the cap priority will apply, and you'll push that out instead of the legacy alert.
So I was just seeing some discussion about that today, and there was a lot of stations figuring out, okay, how in the world am I going to dictate that? But what it sounds like, and I'll ask this question to Harold, is that's going to be a software update. That's something for the manufacturers to solve, not necessarily the broadcasters to solve.
Yeah, the manufacturer provides the tools that allows the software or the broadcaster to decide what they want to do. In the petitions uh, about the notice of back when it was just a notice of proposed rulemaking, there was discussion of allowing the stations to have a wider latitude of how long they wanted to wait. Uh, the FCC went the route of making some firm specifications, but for the average broadcaster, it'll just become part of their set and forget. It's just something that the equipment will do for them automatically. It will wait if it has an alert that isn't from iPause, it'll wait, see if it can get one, match them up. If they match, it will put the iPause alert on the air preferentially. So that this will just happen. Uh, in some cases, that's available now from some manufacturers. In the case of Sage, we'll make that available early next year, and we'll have until December of 2023 to get it installed.
Okay. So getting into what is now then down the pike, or actually before we get into that, was there also some changes in terms of, I believe I saw something about event codes that were changing, like for instance, the emergency action notification that was changing, a national periodic test called the nationwide test of the emergency alert system. Is that what's forthcoming for this next year? Or is that part of the proposed rules that are coming?
That's the same
That's
as for
part
the
of the
cap rules.
Okay. So that, and again, this is all just going to be little changes. So is it going so I guess the acronym for that, if you're doing that on your EAS log, is it going to change from NPT to, I guess, NTEAS? Like, is that the different, going to be a
No,
completely code?
there was a lot of pushback against changing the codes because it would have caused ripples up and down the ecosystem as to what needed change. The FCC agreed, based on all the comments they got, to keep the behind the scenes acronyms the same, but to change what the public sees. So we'll come in as an NPT, National Periodic Test, but what appears on crawls and in text to speech, backup text to speech, is a canned message the FCC has laid out that removes any possibility, they hope, of someone assuming that this is an actual event rather than just a test. That was the intent for this. And to make the audio portion match the text, even if the message doesn't come through iPause. One of the big promises of Cap and iPause is you put out text that is free-form text and it matches what the audio is. You get a legacy alert. All you can do is say the originator has issued an event for these locations beginning at X and ending at Y. That's canned. Uh, the FCC has taken that away and come up with a more flowery descriptive text for the national periodic test. So the public, again, won't see anything. The broadcasters won't have to do anything. I mean, the public won't see anything that they're going to notice as being radically different. They'll just see better text, cleaner text. The broadcasters won't need to do anything other than, require the software update and get it installed by the end of next year.
So this sounds like it is the intent of this is just to make it more clear to the public to understand what it is they're seeing and to I guess, there's some discussion of like, well, with the monthly tests, there is the text that accompanies those monthly tests, usually that explains this is a monthly test and goes into detail, as opposed to usually RWTs, it's just 12 seconds of noises and it's done. So this just kind of gives a little bit more clarification to what it is the listener's actually hearing to hopefully or I guess this is the intent behind it, and correct me if I'm wrong, that to make it more clear to the public what it is they're hearing so they don't get confused and just kind of ignore what the EAS system is.
Well, this is primarily for National Periodic Test. Weekly tests don't change. The weekly test is defined as not needing audio. So it is essentially just the data tones and the ending tones. Stations will sometimes have a lead into it. The following is a test of the emergency alert system, and then they'll play the weekly test. The monthly test, that's like all other alerts. It will still be the canned message a required monthly test has been issued for. It's really only the National Periodic Test is what the end users will see that has the biggest change. And that was primarily just to make sure everybody knew that it was a test. It says something like the federal government has issued a periodic
The
test of the
typical
emergency alert
preamble
system. No
we've been
action
used
is
to
required.
hearing.
It's
Yeah.
what the audio has. It's close to what the audio has been. It's just the text is different. And the reason why I think they did that was that the National Periodic Test is the only one where everybody's device goes off simultaneously. All cable, radio, TV, within 20 seconds or so, everybody starts to get that message. And in some years, they couple it with a WEA version of the same thing. So everything happens at once. It sounds scarier because it's coming from everywhere, and they've improved the text to make sure that it's clear that it's a test, no action is required.
Well, but there is one that they are changing, which is they're changing the emergency action notification to be called the National Emergency Message. But that sounds like it's only for national alerts. So it is
That's for the
actually they are
EAN.
okay.
Well, there are two
So they
national
are
alerts. There's a
actually
National Periodic Test, and then there's also the Emergency Action Notification, and it gets a
okay.
new moniker as well. But internally, the internal codes haven't changed, and therefore, EAS participants don't need to make any changes to their setup. They just need to
Okay.
install the new software.
Okay, so moving on to what is actually being proposed, and there's a lot that's involved. And I guess the overarching theme of this is in the name of cybersecurity and preventing somebody getting unauthorized access to EAS systems and sending out false alerts or sending out, well, I guess false alerts would be the proper term for it. So I guess can you guys and I'm looking at Patrick and Stephen break down what exactly is involved and what is being proposed right now?
Sure. And let me start by saying I think that this is one of those situations where I think that the regulator here, the FCC, is coming from the right place in making these proposals. They are, I think, truly looking to help the broadcast industry get their arms around cybersecurity, not just with respect to EAS, but cybersecurity more generally. And some of the language in the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking really makes that clear. The FCC also really made clear in this Notice of Proposed Rulemaking that the agency itself feels like it has been beating this drum for over a decade and that the broadcast industry has not stepped up to the plate in a way that has satisfied the FCC. In fact, the FCC says, despite these admonitions, and the admonitions being several points over the last decade where the FCC has asked the industry to adopt and follow cybersecurity best practices, the FCC says, despite these admonitions, however, we have not observed meaningful security improvements. So the FCC here really views there to be work to be done by the broadcast industry. And again, that's not solely with respect to preventing unauthorized access to the EAS system and to individual station EAS equipment, but really cybersecurity more generally than that. And again, is that a laudable goal? Sure. There are, as the FCC observes in its notice, there are multiple other federal agencies that have either recently adopted cybersecurity responsibilities as part of their own individual um, regulation of other industries, or that are currently working on cybersecurity issues with respect to their own uh, idiosyncratic regulated industries. So the FCC here is certainly not out of step with what the federal government is doing generally and what other regulatory agencies are doing with their regulated entities. And here, the one additional step I would say, or additional factor, is that EAS really is all about maximizing opportunities for public safety, and that can be compromised, as has already been discussed, I think, pretty robustly during this session. That can be compromised um, by alerts not being distributed, by false alerts being distributed, and public confusion and potentially public fatigue for the system. So I think they're coming from the right place. Whether or not they will execute and reach their goals in the correct manner is yet to be seen. We've got industry players of all different shapes and sizes. We've got publicly traded companies. We've got groups that own hundreds of broadcast stations on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have individual mom and pop ownership of a small cluster of stations, or individual ownership maybe by a church of one station here and there. The cybersecurity needs are certainly going to be different based on the particular broadcasters involved. Patrick, you want to talk a little bit about some of the proposals?
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, I think as to dovetail on that as well, a large focus of the NPRM is certainly cybersecurity. I think more broadly, it is also about operational readiness for EAS equipment. And the FCC cited the 2021 NPT results in sort of arriving at some of these conclusions. We've talked about thus far in this session about the express sort of false alerts that were issued and potential, default passwords that were left over that raised cybersecurity concerns. But from that 2021 NPT, the FCC said that there were about 5% of broadcasters that were unable to participate due to equipment failures, and more than 5,000 EAS participants that were using outdated software or equipment. And so the reason why I mention that is because one of the first proposals that they tee up there is as the rules currently exist, broadcast stations have 60 days in which to repair malfunctioning EAS equipment without the need for any further notice to the FCC. It's a 60-day window once your equipment becomes defective to get it repaired. You can seek additional time as well by submitting an informal request to the local field office, the FCC field office. But that 60-day period is something that's discussed in the NPRM as one of the first things that the FCC tees up. And the question there is whether or not it should be replaced with something more akin to sort of, reasonable diligence, promptly and with reasonable diligence, or maybe 24 hours of giving notice that, hey, our equipment's gone down and we'll let you know once we've fixed it and we've resumed operations. So that's the first sort of notice requirement that I would flag. There's a second notice requirement as well that's for unauthorized access of the EAS equipment. And this ties more directly to the cybersecurity concerns that we have. And so with EAS equipment, I don't just mean the NDEC, I don't just mean the core functional EAS equipment there, but it's any communications infrastructure at the station that might have an effect on the EAS equipment and the EAS output that's coming through the station. The suggestion there is potentially notification to the FCC within 72 hours of when the station knew or should have known. And I think, as to attorneys, should have known is a buzzword that's has a very specific legal connotation. I think is interesting in the context of this NPRM, and we can discuss that more a little bit later on if folks are interested. But the sort of those two are the notice requirements, and then finally moving on, I think we get to the core sort of thing that most folks are interested in and have been discussing as part of this, which is the cybersecurity plan. And so this would require stations to adopt and implement a full-scale sort of cybersecurity plan with defined characteristics that discuss things like multi-factor authentication and sort of what we're going to do about password management, resiliency, and EAS operations in general. The notion there would be that stations would annually certify to their having the cybersecurity plan in place. That would happen at the same time the station files the Form 1, which is the annual filing with the FCC to update the information about your broadcast EAS equipment. But it's not a toothless sort of check the box and get out of jail free card. The FCC would have the ability to request and review your cybersecurity plan at any time. And so it would truly be something that stations would need to continually monitor and update and actually have in place. Otherwise put, a station couldn't just set it and forget it. They would need to be continually sort of evaluating their cybersecurity plan and practice. Anything else on that?
Yeah, boy, there's an awful lot more on that I'd like
Well,
to get
yeah,
into.
I was going to say, guys, there's a few questions that I want to follow up here because I've been taking some notes as you guys were saying this because, yeah, there's an by that alone. And a couple of questions that, at least the first ones that come to mind is you had talked about the FCC having the interest in this, along with the federal government as far as cybersecurity efforts. So we kind of know the backstory of why they're getting involved in this. Is this is overall kind of a greater push? Do you think that so far that this is obviously their interest is through the public alerting process, but do you think that this might extend to, or their interest is to get stations more secure in general, to keep people out of transmitters, to keep people out of STLs, and basically prevent unauthorized access to stations in general? Do you think that's the direction that's going?
I think that the language in the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking is broad enough that it very well may cover those types of um, that that type of overall security. After all, they're talking the notice speaks in terms specifically of EAS, but then goes a step further and talks about essentially anything in the communications systems that could affect EAS. So if we take that to its natural, all the way to its natural conclusion, I think it's fair to say that the station's ability to put an EAS alert out on the air is critical to the functionality of the EAS as a public warning system. Therefore, I think all components of the communications system, I think that would include transmitters. I think that, if somebody comes and strips a transmitter site of copper wiring, I think that affects the communications system of a broadcaster. That could affect the ability of that broadcaster to get an emergency alert onto the air. And the FCC might be taking a view here that would be something that would be potentially reportable if it were to adopt the rules as proposed.
Yeah, and so the next question I have is you had talked about the notice of the requirement of 60 days, obviously, with if the equipment isn't functional, but with the unauthorized access, and I'm sure we'll get into the what you think the legal definition of what was it, the known intention or somebody got into it, so the known. That somebody got into their system and had the unauthorized access. But I guess one of the concerns that I hear, and you guys can maybe speak to how legitimate this is a station would be hesitant to report something like that for fear of being punished. I mean, if this is a self-reporting system, how serious do you think that?
Oh, I think I just lost you at the end of that there, but I think I can probably guess where you were going. And this, I think this ties into the should have known that you were referencing. It's that within 72 hours of when the broadcaster knew or should have known And in the legal world, typically we think of should have known as a backward facing inquiry. It's not you discover this and then you have 72 hours, the clock starts. That would be new. Once you knew that something happened, you had 72 hours. Should have known is something akin to, a reasonability standard. If you had had reasonable practices in place, if you had reasonably sort of been monitoring your EAS equipment and the cybersecurity thereof, then you would or you should have known within 72 hours that this had happened, and you should have reported it. So to me, that speaks directly to your concern that you just articulated of that being sort of a hook for enforcement and potential liability to stations. And I think that that also ties directly into the notion of having a sufficient cybersecurity plan. I mean, we see this in the FCC's rules and regulations elsewhere, where they have sort of rules that dovetail together that can combine for enforcement problems. For instance, if you don't disclose a missing file in your online public inspection file in a broadcast renewal, then the FCC is liable to hit you for number one, hey, you didn't have this required file. That's a fine. Number two, you lied to us. You should have told us about that. You should have disclosed it. So you misrepresented something to us when you said everything was filed correctly. And so this feels to me like a potential area where you could be hit simultaneously for you didn't report it and you should have known that there was unauthorized access. Oh, hey, and by the way, that means you probably didn't have a sufficient cybersecurity plan in place, or at least you weren't monitoring it with the diligence that you should have.
I think that's exactly right, Patrick. I think that there's a real concern, there should be a real concern here about how the FCC's goals of a more robust EAS system here, how those goals can become shifted, and a new goal can be an enforcement gotcha. And when you're talking about the backwards looking language, the when should a regulated entity, when should they have known about something, it puts the regulator in a position to second guess what the broadcaster actually knew in real time. And it's always done with the benefit of hindsight, and we all know that hindsight is always 2020. And when you're talking about the regulator who's coming in and making that examination, I think this is fraught with the potential of becoming a gotcha situation.
So let me give a hypothetical of what a station would know if they had unauthorized access. So most of us, we do our weekly EAS logs. We come in sometime Monday, we review what was sent out over the past week, what was received, what was sent out. So we see an alert that ran the previous Tuesday at 11 p.m. that we didn't hear, nobody heard on the air, but it doesn't look right. You think it looks suspicious. Is that something that you'd immediately say, uh-oh, this doesn't look right? Now the question would be, does the clock start from that past Tuesday to 72 hours, or when you caught it the following Monday?
That could become, that's at least an $8,000 question, which is the base fine for an EAS violation, but it could be
from your legal firm for.
it could become the $1 million question. And I think that if the station's standard protocol is to review their logs for the prior week on a Monday, then I think that that's a reasonable place to begin the 72-hour clock. The FCC, though, as the regulator who gets the benefit of second guessing the station, might say, well, you should have heard that the rogue alert go out at 11 o'clock on Wednesday of the prior week, and therefore the 72-hour clock clearly started ticking at that point. You did not show reasonable diligence. You did not do enough. You did not do what a reasonable regulated entity would do. That's the risk. I'm not saying that we know that that's the position the FCC would take. I think that what the FCC would look at are a broad variety of factors and circumstances that went into this situation. Was this the first time this had happened? Had you always had a policy of looking back at your logs on a weekly basis? Were there other problems that you discovered prior to that that should have given you some inkling that maybe your protocols and processes needed to become more robust? I think there are going to be a slew of factors that the FCC would look at in those circumstances to figure out when that 72-hour window would open. And I also think, the 72-hour piece it's something that we can really grasp onto because it's numerical and it is well defined. But I think that the FCC's biggest concern isn't going to be, did it take a station 48 hours versus 96 hours, 48 hours being within the 72-hour window, 96 hours being outside of the 72-hour window. I think that the FCC is going to have bigger fish to fry than splitting hairs over the exact number of hours that something takes to discover. And they're going to be looking at, on the one hand, we didn't discover this for 6 months. 6 months had passed before we figured out that there was a problem versus, well, did it take us 4 days to figure it out? Yes, because that's the normal time that it took for us to look at the logs for the prior week. So I
So
think that
what I'm hearing is that it's a lot of what they're trying to weed out is the willful ignorance, and that if you're honest about it, if you're upfront with what's happened and what you're doing to rectify the situation, they're more willing to work with you and overlook things, as opposed to the stations that go, like you said, 6 months without doing logs and have no idea what's happening in their own facility.
I think that's a fair way to characterize it. I certainly, as a lawyer, would never advise any of my clients, nor any members of the SBE. I would never give guidance that says, "Oh, the FCC says 72 hours, but don't worry about 72 hours. 96 hours is going to be fine." I certainly wouldn't say that, but I think the way that you characterized it there is probably an accurate way. That's a good takeaway, I think, Kevin.
Okay. So we have a bunch of questions that are coming in on YouTube, and thank you to everybody. We hope to get to those here in just a few minutes. But before we get to those, what else is involved in this? There seems to be a lot that's already involved. What else is in this notice of proposed rulemaking that stations need to know?
Well, I think it's a lot of it really gets down into the granularity. And so we've just, to give you an example, with the unauthorized access component that we just discussed of 72 hours of when a station knew or should have known, perhaps anticipating some of what we've just discussed, the FCC said, what if we instead defined it as reasonable belief, as when the station had a reasonable belief that their systems were compromised and that unauthorized access occurred. There's a lot of questioning in this NPRM about the potential proposals, about the specifics of the potential proposals, as well as a general inquiry for data about sort of the current status of the security of the EAS system. And so, there's also aspects of it that discuss confidentiality and the fact that these reports would be treated as presumptively confidential, again, under the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. So this is all hypothetical. We're shadowboxing to some extent. But the FCC is looking at treating them as presumptively confidential, but that could be shared in between governmental agencies. Which certainly, makes sense on first blush, obviously, as the FCC being able to discuss issues that they receive that are reported from a station. I'll use my home state, North Carolina, where you've got a primary entry point station where they've received something about unauthorized access, and so maybe they want to talk to the local government, the Department of Public Safety here, some sort of government actor that may need to have information for situational awareness about what's going on with that particular alert. So there's discussion about that. There's a lot of discussion as well about the particular contents of the cybersecurity plan that would need to be in place, and the ways that a station could sort of fulfill the obligation to have a cybersecurity plan in place that checks the FCC's boxes as they expect it to make sure that data is wiped from the old equipment that gets thrown away. That's another sort of pressure point that a lot of folks probably don't think about. And so that's a lot of it. The other sort of item that I will throw out is at the end they do propose varying time frames for compliance, which kind of harkens back to the beginning of this and the delayed effective date that we're seeing for the new cap priority mandate. Here, as proposed, again, we're all talking in proposed, but the filings for non-operational equipment would be 30 days after. There's a separate agency process that all of this would have to go through after FCC approval. The Office of Management and excuse me, the Office of Management and Budget would have to approve of all of this information collection because it's going to require more broadcasters to do more work and fill out more information and provide it to the federal government. Once that's approved, it would be 30 days from that approval for the filings on non-operational equipment. It would be 60 days after approval by OMB for reporting any incidents of unauthorized access. And the cybersecurity plans, again, sort of like our cap priority mandate that we're seeing, that would be a year after it's published in the register, after OMB approves of that. So the FCC is trying to somewhat anticipate sort of the need to give broadcasters some runway to get these items into place, especially smaller broadcasters who might not already have cybersecurity practices in place.
So is the FCC going to give us any guidance? You keep referencing this the cybersecurity plan. Is the FCC going to give us any guidance to what needs to be in that plan?
So they are. They have in the notice of proposed rulemaking, they have flagged a number of topics that they believe need to be in such a plan, and they have also observed that they don't think that a one-size-fits-all approach makes any sense. I think they're right about that. Again, based on the vast variety of broadcasters and broadcast groups and locations and size and resources that are available, they've teed up some potential models. The NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, it may be that the FCC says flags NIST as a great resource for stations to use. On the other hand, I would expect that there will be other similar. Who knows? Maybe the SBE itself gets into the game in terms of assisting with evaluating cybersecurity or helping stations to evaluate cybersecurity. But I think at the end of the day, it's interesting when Patrick said, there are certain boxes that need to be checked for a cybersecurity plan. That's absolutely true. And checking of the boxes is going to be important. And the FCC is going to tell us what a number of those boxes are. But even more important than checking the boxes is the concept that no broadcaster merely check the boxes, but instead that broadcasters remain vigilant and diligent at all times on an ongoing basis. That's really the end game here. And so there may be a broadcaster in a small broadcaster in a remote area that truly has very little cybersecurity risk because so little of its operation is connected to the public internet, and because of the way that its physical plant is set up, it may face very little risk. It may have a cybersecurity plan that is short and sweet and does not need a lot of regular updating. But that is probably the exception and not the rule. And what the FCC is more concerned about than the number of paragraphs or pages in a written cybersecurity plan, the FCC is much more concerned with making sure that stations have really thoughtfully structured their plan, that they have taken into account all the types of things that they need to take into account, given the size of the broadcaster, given the nature of their physical location, given the nature of their technological needs, and that they routinely and regularly go through a process to evaluate and update that. And I think part of, again, what's animating this is I think the FCC feels like it's throwing up its hands and saying, you guys didn't come through for us. And so now we have to, as the regulator, now we need to come in and require you to do it because we don't think that you're already doing it.
So I have a question about that because for a lot of stations, this isn't going to really change much. They're already doing best practices. They have great IT security and run good operations. And that's not to imply that other people are bad broadcasters. But my question is there, for the broadcasters that this is intended to reach, I guess, this gives the FCC some teeth to enforce them into compliance. But do you think that that's going to change much? Do you think that they'll actually be able to, uh, in other words, the stations that this impacts, they're already not complying with the rules. So do you think there's going to be a lot that changes because of this?
You want to take a crack at that, Patrick? That's a great observation.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, what it makes me think of, Kevin, is Stephen and I were talking last week about the fact that, the Form 1 filings that are required to annually update information, stations miss that. And the FCC thus far has not taken sort of an enforcement heavy look at that. It's more sort of, okay, we understand that, just make sure and get it on file next year. We're just trying to make sure that the broadcast EAS network is in place. At some point, that's going to change, and I think this being tied to the Form 1 filing gives that FCC sort of an easy way to see get a little bit more insight into which stations are and are not complying. I think at the end of the day, it is still currently in a system, and I think you just saw this with all the state EAS plans being filed in the new alert reporting system with all the state emergency communication committees that went through this. That happened back in July, and you've only had 4 of those state plans thus far that have been approved. It was a pretty short timeline to get those approved, and so I had expected to see many, many more approved by this date. I think what that means is that a lot of those state plans are going to wind up going back for further review, and I think it speaks sort of as part of this problem with the Form 1 and as part of the cybersecurity issue that we're looking at here, where the FCC, I hope, for the foreseeable future, is going to be understanding and give stations rope and leeway to try and get these things into place. But at the end of the day, the rules are there with I would say an enforcement angle, and I think intentionally so, because there can only be so much rope before I think the FCC believes it has to try another method to accomplish its goals.
Well,
Another
guys,
comment
this has
from
been
Harold here.
awesome so far, and we've gotten some questions that I want to get to here in just a moment as we're running out of time. Did you have something to say, Harold?
I just don't want people to underestimate the difference between stations that have an IT department and the majority of smaller stations that simply don't. And the difference here with the old rules and the new rules is uh, the for this reason, we propose to require an EAS participant report any instance of unauthorized access to EAS equipment, including infrastructure that serves to prevent unauthorized access, including firewalls and virtual private networks. They're not looking for a simple review of the log to see whether a bogus alert got on the air. They're looking to see if anybody logged into your station who shouldn't have for any reason through any path because your EAS equipment is connected to your station. Uh, Simply looking at the log, whether weekly now, as folks do, or even once every 72 hours, this is a whole new class of things to look at. And a lot of stations, when we ask for technical reasons, they can't get to iPods anymore. We say, well, do you have a firewall? As any changes made to it, the number of honest folks who have their hearts in the right place to say, I don't think I have a firewall. I don't know what one is. What would it look like? And there are hundreds and hundreds of stations who are in that condition. Uh, and if they have a box to tick, they're being forced to tick a box without the ability of understanding what box they're ticking, or enough money to hire somebody to come in and tell them what you need to tick, and then 3 months later that person needs to come in again. Yes, it has to be done. Cybersecurity is very important. An awful lot of stations are in absolutely no position to understand it or pay for it.
Yeah. This is some great insight. A couple of questions that we got. One that I'll address to you real quick, Harold. Any plans or discussions on National Weather Service going to IPAWS for weather alerts in the near future?
There are always discussions. There have been discussions since 2012. Uh, there have been a lot of problems that have been identified, reasons why it can't be done technically. I don't think anything is going to happen real soon. I think they are working on various things. There's a couple problems that need to be solved. There are two of them. Duplication of problems. The problem is a message comes into the weather service, it goes to transmitter A, and it also goes to transmitter B. Transmitter A has a subset of areas that it wants to talk to. Transmitter B has a different subset. So it was the same message. Here's a message, it's got 5 counties. One transmitter sends 3 counties when it actually sends the brap, brap, brap. The other transmitter only sends 2. Anybody in the middle is going to hear 2 different alerts, and they're not going to be detectable as duplicates. One's got 3 counties, one's got 2 counties. They're going to put them both on the air. That happens now. You're geographically protected because usually that second National Weather Service transmitter is on the other side of the mountain. Once they start doing it with CAP, well, there is no geographical distinction now. You're going to get the CAP message with all 5. You're going to hear one with 3 and maybe another one with just 2. How do you keep from putting the alert on the air 3 times? That's one problem that needs solved. The other one is they're not including audio with their CAP messages, so they're all text to speech. The text that comes out of the National Weather Service is great for their purposes, but it's not great for using text to speech to put it on broadcast air. So those 2 problems still remain to be solved, and I think they're honestly working on them. But I don't think real soon now is a moniker I'd attach to it.
Chris, are we doing okay on time? We got a chance for one more question.
Yeah, we could probably squeeze one more in.
All right. So so this one's actually a good one, and I'll post to whoever can get to this one. But Kirk, I believe that's Kirk, that says the LPTVBA has started claiming that with triggered cap polling, there's no need to require LPTV to purchase EAS boxes. They say they should be able to issue alerts purely over cap. Is that even feasible?
Well,
Of
the
course, that's
FCC
bad for your
requires.
business model.
Well, it's the FCC currently requires receiving alerts over the air, brap, 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 as part of the continuity government requirement of FEMA. Uh, that's said and done. If they decide they don't want to do that anymore, then yes, you could go to a system like in Canada where it's simply cap based. Here in the US, EAS is meant for several purposes, and one of them is legacy EAS alert delivery and relay. Them's
Well,
is the
so
rules.
it sounds like the answer is no. You still need to buy the
I
EAS box.
Yeah, yes, but according to Part 11,
Yeah.
Yeah,
you've still got
under
all
current
the land.
rules, I agree with that.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. This has been awesome, and we could probably sit here and talk for another hour about this. But Stephen Hartzell, Patrick Cross from Brooks Pierce, thank you so much, and Harold Price from Sage Alerting. You guys have been great and extremely knowledgeable on this topic, so we thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our pleasure.
All right. And Chris, I'll hand this back to you to close things out for us.
All right. There are a couple more questions on the YouTube feed. Those who haven't gotten your questions answered, if you want to send an email to webextra@sbe.org, I'll do my best to get those funneled through and we'll get an answer back to you. But thank you, Kevin. And as was noted, this has been the SBE Web Extra, the SBE chapter of the web. We present it monthly, and we hope you'll join us each time. We'll post the replay on our YouTube channel, usually within about a day. If you hold SBE certification, viewing the SBE Web Extra qualifies you for 1/2 point in Category G, that's attendance. It's just like attending a local chapter meeting. And if you have an idea for a topic or a guest for the SBE Web Extra, send it to us at webextra@sbe.org. And that does it for this installment from the Society of Broadcast Engineers, the Association for Broadcast and Multimedia Technology Professionals. Thanks again to our guests, Stephen Hartzell and Patrick Cross, and Harold Price. On behalf of Kevin Trueblood, we'll see you next month.